Good evening. Sorry to everyone that's outside, but as someone that spent most of my career doing fire research, we have to obey those fire marshal guidelines. They're important. So, good evening. Welcome to the Horace M. Albright Lecture in Conservation. I'm Keith Gillis. I'm Dean of the College of Natural Resources and a forest economist by training and vocation. If we could start with just a couple housekeeping details. There will be question and answer at the end, and we will have two runners with mics, and we'd love you to wait to get the mic in your hand to start your question. I know the speaker could hear you, but the video pickup of your voice for those that'll be watching the video of this wouldn't be able to hear your question. And we actually have far more people get access to this lecture series by the video of it that we'll be posting than are in the room. So let's respect them and have our questions on the mics. Mine's on vibrate, so please make sure yours is as well. Okay, the Albright Lecture Series has been going strong on this campus for over 50 years. It's a wonderful tribute to Horace Albright and the many achievements of his life and career. As most of this crowd probably knows, Horace Albright's the person among many that we really owe a debt to for the creation of our marvelous national park system, and probably among that group, Horace Albright more than any other. We're delighted that we have this lecture series to honor his memory and continue the public good that he started. Our speaker this evening is in very good company with those past speakers in the series. We've had Ansel Adams, Carl Pope, Paul and Ann Ehrlich, other key figures from government, industry, and the nonprofit world have given us wonderful and engaging presentations in the series, and I'm sure that Bill McKibben's will be remembered in that company. I assume most of you know who he is, but indulge me for just a minute to give him a proper introduction. Bill is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College. He's the author of a dozen books about the environment, beginning with The End of Nature in 1989, which is widely regarded as the first book on climate change to reach a general audience. He's the founder of the grassroots climate campaign 350.org, which is coordinated by the count I found of 15,000 rallies in 189 countries since 2009. In 2010, Time magazine described him as the world's best green journalist. His writing is wonderful and persuasive. In my household, I tend to read The Economist in the evening. My wife, Jan, reads The New Yorker. When there's really good stuff about the environment in The New Yorker, she says, Keith, you have to read this. That was my introduction to Bill McKibben. I went on after that introduction to assign all or part of The End of Nature in more than 10 freshman seminars I've taught over the years in environmental literature. Given that the other weeks in that freshman seminar are on themes like Muir, Thoreau, Abbey, Carson. It gives you a feeling for the standing that many of us hold Bill in terms of his writing and how students react to his writing. He's had his share of media fame over the last couple weeks, and as you can see, the shackles actually are off. That was an interesting bit he told us about earlier today. So please give a warm welcome to our speaker, Bill McKibben.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for being here. What a pleasure to get to be here. I feel a little bad that there's everybody outside who I'm like literally have my back pointing. I feel rude, but I think that if I understand the way TV works, they're actually seeing my front. Which I don't know is no great bargain either, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Anything named for in the memory of Horace Albright, of course. And also just to be in Berkeley and on this campus and kind of surrounded by the many echoes of the conservation movement in this country. you know, one of the things that Berkeley will always mean for me is the place where one of my great heroes, David Brower, grew up and, you know, learned how to rock climb up on Indian Rock up there and spent his, you know, spent his life here. And one of the last times I was in town really was for his memorial service at Berkeley High School. And it's, well, it's always good to be in his neck of the woods and in yours. I'm well aware from having a number of people tell me so that the reason they came tonight is because I was in jail 2 weeks ago. So let's get out of the way right at the beginning, okay? Do our best. I highly recommend that you actually, unless you have some very good reason, like trying to stop global warming, that you don't do anything that will land you in central cell block in DC. It's exactly as much fun as it sounds like it might be. We spent 80 of us or so, 3 days and 2 nights there, and, you know, handcuffed at the leg to each other and things like that. And it was, and yet people have said to me several times since how, you know, brave we were to do this. I have to tell you the truth, we were not brave at all. We got arrested that first day under the assumption, and as the police had promised us, that they'd really only be detaining us for the afternoon and we'd be out in the evening, because that's about what you would expect if you're arrested for the offense of failure to yield, which is a traffic offense after all. It turns out that the first wave of people who went down for these tar sands protests, about which I'll talk more in a moment, when the police saw that in fact there were hundreds of people committed to come over the next 2 weeks, they decided they didn't really want to deal with that kind of workload, and that perhaps if they treated the first batch of us a little harshly, the rest might stay away. And that's how we ended up where we were, you know, 2 to a cell on, not on beds, on just sort of metal slabs without mattress or pillow, you know, one bologna sandwich at 3 a.m. and another at 3 p.m. And it was no fun, but it didn't take any bravery to get there at all. The brave people were the 80 people who showed up the next day, day 2 of this thing. Because they were, by this time, fully expecting that they were going to have to go to jail, all right? And it did not matter. They showed up. And then the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, for 15 days, until 1,200 and Jamie, 53 people. Jamie Henn, our communications director for things, is over here. 1,253 people had been arrested, which apparently is the largest display of civil disobedience in this century in this country. And there's a couple of people, I think, in this room who may have gone to jail. If you did, raise your hands over there. I see a few people who were arrested. The hard part for me of this protest was not getting handcuffed and going off, although that was, you know, new and in its way difficult. The hard part every morning was talking to people before they went off, having to sort of give the last talk. Because though after that first day the police treated people well, it still was a very big deal, day after day after day. And that's what I found myself saying every morning to this circle of people out there on Lafayette Plaza. You know what? What you're doing is extraordinary, sort of literally extraordinary, out of the ordinary. For most of us who are law-abiding people, it's a very difficult thing to go do something that the police are telling you not to do, okay? We're not used to that in any way. And to have your hands cuffed behind your back and be put in a paddy wagon and things, that takes a certain kind of commitment, especially, and this was very true of this entire 2 weeks, if the people who are engaging in this work are not kind of the usual suspects for whom this is a more regular kind of occurrence. this was not what this crowd was about, all right? We asked people when they signed up. I thought it would be rude to ask them how old they were, so we asked people who was president when you were born, okay? And the two biggest cohorts that went off to the jail were born in the FDR administration and the Truman administration, okay? The last day we were there, the oldest guy who got arrested is 86 years old. He had a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. This guy was from the Harding administration, okay? So here's the question that I want to try and answer tonight. And I can't answer it perfectly, but I can answer it, I think, to some degree, having talked with an awful lot of people. And that question is, why were people willing to do this? Why, around an issue that even 2 months before most of them didn't know about, I didn't really know about, this pipeline to the tar sands, why were people willing to go do something extraordinary? What made those, and that's what I want to try and talk about for a minute, partly because I hope that we can get everybody in this room deeply involved, not going to jail necessarily, but deeply involved in this fight. And I think that the bottom line answer to that question, why, is because climate change is no longer an abstract thing at all. It is a very real, very powerful, well, it's the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, and by a large margin, and it's around us all the time, and hence there's a great desire among an awful lot of us to figure out what on earth we could do to try and slow it down. When I say climate change is real, I mean like this instant, this day before yesterday in Texas, there were wildfires like you could not believe. Bastrop County, Austin, just waves of flame, taking out whole suburbs. The guy who, the head of the Texas Forest Fire Service said, and I quote, "No human being has ever fought fire in conditions like these." And he was not exaggerating. The humidity was 8, 9, 10%, okay? It's been absolutely unprecedented heat wave going on. I mean, there's parts of Texas, many parts, that haven't had appreciable rainfall now for a year, okay? Austin, where many of the fires were centered, in a normal year gets about 10 days over 100 degrees. It's been over 100 degrees going on 80 days now this year in Austin. Austin and Houston last week set all-time high temperature records, had never been warmer there, okay? Meanwhile, yesterday in Pennsylvania and on into the southern tier of New York, the trailing remnants of Tropical Storm Lee and Katia combined, having come over extremely warm water, record warm water, and hence picked up record amounts of rainfall, combined to drop astonishing amounts of water on those places. We've been measuring rainfall in places like Wilkes-Barre for 100 or 200 years. The rainfall in Wilkes-Barre yesterday apparently broke the old record by 60%. Okay, the week before that, it was my home state of Vermont. Okay, we have temperature record and rainfall records going back a long ways. But when Tropical Storm Irene came up the coast, it went over the warmest water ever recorded off New Jersey and New York. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air. It just picked it up like a sponge and carried it inland. The previous rainfall record day for Vermont was 9 inches. 11 inches fell that day. You're not supposed to break 100-year-old, 200-year-old records by 20% when they break. This falls so far outside the norm that it's beyond almost comprehension, and certainly beyond the capacity of Vermont or any place else to, I mean, Vermont's 80% forest. It's about the most forested state in the Union. If any place should be able to hold that kind of water, it's Vermont. But that rain is falling on a different planet than that forest grew up on. And so bridges, covered bridges that had stood for 150 years are washed down the river. It is eerie to see. And of course, we live, at least for the moment, in a part of the world that has enough money to begin to cope with this kind of thing, at least for a little while. Though it's going to straighten even us. Vermont will spend the next 10 years trying to get back to where it was 2 weeks ago, But when it happens, as it is happening in place after place after place around the planet that is poor, it's almost impossible. Pakistan last summer had flooding of a biblical dimension. Up in the Khyber Pass, where they normally get 3 feet of rain a year, they got 12 feet of rain in a week at the beginning of August. And that's why the Indus River swelled to the point where it covered a quarter of the country, and why 7 million people were homeless. There's still a few million homeless people there. We think the biggest thing that happened in the last year in Pakistan was that Osama bin Laden got shot, but that's not what people in Pakistan think. They think the biggest thing that happened is that development and so on is deferred now because they're trying to put tarps over people's heads, rebuild bridges, do all those sort of things. I, at some level, have been, I suppose, had longer to expect this than most people. I wrote the first book on climate change 22 years ago, first book for non-scientists, a book called The End of Nature. And at the time, at the time we knew everything basically that we needed to know about climate change. We knew that when you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon in the atmosphere. And we knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The only thing we didn't know was how fast and how hard it was going to pinch. And the story of the last 20 years is that it's pinching much harder and much faster than we thought. I mean, we've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree to date. We add about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface. 20 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that that would be enough to make a huge difference yet. We thought it would take us kind of the threshold of global warming impact, but not really over it. That's because, and we should always remember this, science is an inherently conservative and cautious enterprise. People underestimate, not overestimate, okay? And it turns out that we really misunderstood how finely balanced the planet was and what that extra dose of solar power was going to do. And what it's done is just, I wrote a kind of companion and bookend to that book last year, this book, Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H. You kind of have to channel your inner Schwarzenegger to sort of pronounce it correctly, sort of Earth. The conceit of the book was that we had already created a planet different enough from the old one to deserve at least a slightly different name, I won't bother adducing all the proofs that go with it all. All you need to do is look at what has happened in the years since it came out. 2010 was the warmest year for which we have records. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records last year. Some of them were unbelievable. We were on the phone one day with the 350.org crew in Pakistan, and one of them said, this was last summer, so one of them said, it's hot here today, and someone else said, well, I was sort of surprised to hear anybody say, it's always hot in Pakistan in the summer, why would you? He said, no, we set the new all-time Asia temperature record today. It's 129 degrees, okay? When you have heat like that, bad things happen all over the place. Arctic sea ice we're within a week of the annual minimum of Arctic sea ice, and it looks like we may well set a new record, if not for extent, the lowest extent, which we may set, certainly for the lowest volume of Arctic sea ice on record. Those pictures that you'll recall from Apollo 8, circling the moon and sending back the first pictures of the Earth, those pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture. There's 40% less ice now in the summer Arctic than there was then. The ocean is 30% more acid than it was then as seawater absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. the changes that we're making are massive and monumental, and they can be read now in every facet of human life. When Russia went through the biggest drought and heat wave in its history last summer, one of the first things that happened was that the Kremlin got spooked and stopped all grain export to the rest of the world, and the price of corn and wheat went up 70% overnight, and that it's stayed there because we've had crop failures in Australia, in Western Europe, now obviously in the American Southwest, on and on and on. When the price of corn and wheat go up 70 or 80%, we notice it, but not that much. The price of a box of cornflakes actually depends very little on the price of corn. It depends more on the price of cardboard than of corn, you know. But if you go and buy cornmeal every day to make tortillas for dinner, then a 70% increase in the price of corn means you eat less than you otherwise would. The number of malnourished people on this planet is rising fast again. After a decade or two of decline, it's heavily on the rise in place after place after place. And the trouble is that all that's happened with 1 degree increase in global temperature. The scientists confidently tell us that unless we get our act together and do it fast, that 1 degree will be 4 degrees before the century is out. And there is no reason to think that we can even begin to cope with that. Last year, agronomists at Stanford and the University of Washington published a really interesting survey in which, of the literature, in which they found that even before you factor in, the availability of water and things, just that sheer increase in temperature takes our major grain crops far enough out of their preferred range that we can expect at this point for every degree increase in the temperature of the planet to see about a 10% decline in grain yields. Try just to do the experiment in your head. You all know enough about this world and its stresses and its wars and its conflicts to begin to understand that this planet with 20% less calories on it is not a place where we're going to do development. It's not a place where we're going to do peace. It's not a place where we're going to be working on women's rights. It's not a place where we're going to be doing a damn thing but trying somehow to cope with one emergency after another. We simply can't let that happen. And yet, we are letting it happen so far. The power of the scientific method has been amply displayed in the last 20 years. Physicists and chemists and climatologists have managed to take an extremely difficult problem and crunch it with great authority and produce a series of workable understandings and answers. They've basically told us the things that we need to do. As powerfully as the scientific method has worked, that's how powerfully the political method has failed, all right? How little we have risen to, and this country is the perfect example. Washington has an unblemished 20-year bipartisan record of accomplishing nothing on this question. And it's not in danger of ending anytime soon, you know. Last summer, when we still had a big majority of Democrats in the US Senate, 60, they could not even bring themselves to take a vote on the most tepid, moderate, tame climate bill you could imagine. They were so scared of the fossil fuel industry that they would not even take a vote. And in fact, that's been the story of politics around this for too long. We thought, I think, for a very long time, that the secret was to have scientists whispering in the ear of our political leaders about the fact that faced the biggest problem in the world, and then they would do something about it. And that was a reasonable theory, except that we forgot that at the same time the fossil fuel industry was going to be bellowing in the other ear of those politicians and bellowing a series of threats backed up with the money to make them real that have prevented any kind of action from taking place. The politics of this are such that unless we make some kind of deep change in what we're doing, we have no chance of doing the things that everyone who studies this problem at this point knows we need to do. And that is why we've spent, some of us, and I'm really happy to have some of my colleagues from 350.org here, we've spent the last, what is it, May? Three and a half years now, trying to build this first real political movement around this issue. We started 350.org in January of 2008 when excuse me, when Jim Hansen, one of the great heroes of this world, the NASA climatologist, our foremost climatologist for 3 decades now, when he and his team published a paper, I think the most important scientific paper of this millennia to date, in which they said, we know enough about carbon to tell now how much is too much. We can look at the paleo data, we can look at real-time observation, and what we conclude is any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Those of you, and I know there are some in this room who spend your time reading scientific papers, know that that is strong language for scientists to use. It is stronger language still when you know that outside here in Berkeley and in Boston and in Buenos Aires and in Beijing and everywhere else on the planet, the atmosphere is 393 parts per million CO2 and rising 2 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic is melting and Vermont is drowning and Texas is burning up and all the rest. It was a daunting paper to read, a kind of real reminder that we're not, whatever else we're going to do, stop global warming. Too late for that. But maybe we can still keep it from getting any worse than it has to get. And we decided that there was something really useful for us about that paper. We were setting out to do global organizing because this is the first global problem we've ever faced. And really, the biggest first issue you face when you do global organizing was not the fact that we had no money or the fact that, it was me and 7 people who'd graduated that year from college who were working. The problem we had, the biggest problem we faced was people all over the earth insist on speaking different languages. And that makes it hard as hell to go out and sort of organize, So we sort of thought, Arabic numerals cross linguistic boundaries. You wouldn't normally use a wonky scientific data point to kind of try and rally around, but maybe it'll work. As I said, there were 7 of these young people. 2 of them are in the audience today. Jamie and May were sitting over there. This was the other advantage we had. 7 young people in 7 continents, a perfect match, okay? Each one took one. May was in charge of North America. Jamie took on the small task of Asia. We made the guy who took the Antarctic also do the internet, because it's kind of its own, And we just set out to see if there were people like us around the world. Now, most places, those people don't call themselves environmentalists, okay? That's not a kind of class that exists everywhere on the planet. But everywhere on the planet, there are people working hard on making sure there's enough food in their communities, on public health, on women's rights, on war and peace, on development, on all the things that are called, on all the things no one's working on in Pakistan right now because they're just trying to throw tarps over people's heads, okay? And these we figured would be natural allies, and so it was. We did training camps in places like Turkey for Central Asia and in the Caribbean, and we did one in Johannesburg for people from all over Africa. We brought 1 or 2 young people from virtually every country on the continent down to Johannesburg, and most had never been on an airplane before or anything, but they were born organizers, and they went back after a week, and we didn't hear that much from them because you can't just constantly Skype people in most of Africa, say. Often the internet isn't working, quite right and things, but we knew they were working hard. We told everybody we were going to take a day, October 24th, 2009, as the kind of coming out party for this number, okay, to try to insert it into the information bloodstream of the planet. We didn't know how it was going to go. But we got our first sense that it might work 2 days early, on October 22nd. We were all sitting down around in a kind of dingy, borrowed office in Lower Manhattan, and the phone rang, and it was a 17-year-old girl from Ethiopia who we'd worked with. She and her 18-year-old sister were our organizers in Ethiopia, and Lily was on the phone. She was almost in tears, and she was saying, the government's taken away our permit for Saturday. We cannot do this thing on Saturday. Ethiopia is not the nicest government in the whole world. We're doing it today before they can stop us, but we're so sorry. We don't want to jump the gun. We don't want to spoil it for everybody. We were so hoping we could do it at the same time as everybody else. And there were 15,000 people out in the street right now in Addis Ababa. And we were like, Lily, don't worry about the date. It's okay. And, for the next 48 hours, pictures like that just rolled in from all over the earth. Before it was done that day, there'd been 5,100 demonstrations in 180 countries, 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history, okay? And I'll just flip through, just for the briefest moment, just a few of these pictures. The next one actually came from U.S. troops in Afghanistan. They made a 350 with sandbags, said we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, okay? And just one after another kind of following the sun around the world. But the thing I want you to notice about these pictures is that if you have ever heard the trope that I have heard many times, that environmentalism is a luxury for rich white people who have taken care of their other problems and that people who have to worry about their daily bread can't be bothered, it turns out that that is nonsense. Most of the people that we were working with around the world were poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what most of the world is, okay? And oddly enough, they care as much about the future as anybody else. Maybe more so because if you're in those categories, right now the future tends to be bearing down on you really hard. And so it was beautiful to see pictures coming in from places I never even heard of, and places that we knew really well. Calcutta, there were 300 big demonstrations across India, places we couldn't identify. That's someplace in Buddhist Asia. Places that were incredibly poor. These are dugout canoes on the Congo River, someplace above Kinshasa. These guys didn't have a digital camera. They developed the picture in some home darkroom. It didn't come out very well, so they wrote in what their banner had said. But, there in what Conrad had called the heart of darkness, there were people who understood and were eager to take part in, to lead this kind of thing. And these pictures just showed up from every corner of the planet, and some of them were very beautiful. There's from the Space Needle, and some of them were, hopefully they didn't stop for too long, and there, just every kind of great image you can imagine, Amazing involvement around the world of, among other things, faith communities for the first time in something like this. There's the head of Muslim South Africa, of indigenous traditions. Behind them in the scarlet, Desmond Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop. Very, very powerful. There's Billy Graham's alma mater, I'd been to Bethlehem to do some organizing. It's not an easy place to get to, but the Dead Sea shrinks quickly as the climate warms and people wanted to do something. So the Jordanians said, we'll do the 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we'll take care of the 0. Those sort of things were moving as can be for us. We were looking for iconic locations everywhere. So palaces in India, but in this country, it was an autumn Saturday, so there we were, the Syracuse cheerleaders helping us out. And just any place you can think of almost, these things going on. Soweto, heartland of resistance to apartheid. They did 350 bungee jumps, but they hung the bungee line, they strung it between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant and sent us a note saying, this is the best use for coal-fired power plants going forward, all right? Place after, I get homesick, so there's my daughter in there someplace, and those are sap buckets because we're losing our maple forest, you know, as the temperature warms. And 300 big demonstrations that Jamie helped organize across China. Not an easy place to do this. One of them got busted up by the police, but the other 290 some went off okay. And there's the China Youth Climate Network making a human wind turbine, and behind them you can just make out the edge of the largest wind farm on this earth, you know. Place after place after place after place, including, of course, our dear, dear brothers and sisters in the Maldives, one of the most paradisical, this 1,200 islands strung across the equator in the Indian Ocean, white sand beaches, palm trees, coral reef around each one. It is paradise. People have lived there for 5,000 years in unbroken culture. The highest point in the Maldives is about 1 meter above sea level. They're almost certainly not going to survive this century. It was successful in that and it was the lead story on Google News for 36 hours. There were more things linking to it than any place else, partly because that's the highest mountain in the Antarctic, because there were people everywhere and because they did not look like what people think environmentalists look like. That zero there is all women in full black burqa, covered head to toe. They do not, to us, appear as if they are environmentalists, but they are mothers and sisters and grandmothers, and of course they're involved. There's some. That's the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi, and you can see some oil-rich sheikhs there in front, and they're. But unlike some of our oil-rich sheikhs, these guys have some sense of which way the world is going. Behind them, they've invested some of their oil riches in the largest solar array on Earth there in Abu Dhabi. It was just a great day, and I confess that there are 600 or 700 pictures in a file just labeled 350 adorable, okay? And they really are adorable, but they're also really a little bit bittersweet, because those girls are going to be refugees by the time they're of an age, unless we figure out very quickly what it is we're going to do. I wish I could tell you that all this effort had won the day. 6 weeks later was that big conference in Copenhagen. We persuaded 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target, so that was okay, but of course they were the wrong 117 nations. They were the poor and vulnerable ones, and the rich and addicted ones, led by our own, were unwilling to do anything, and so the movie did not end the way it's supposed to, and the meeting was scuttled, and I thought maybe this would kill this whole infant movement in its cradle, but no. People were made of sterner stuff than that, my colleagues and our friends from all over the world. In fact, that last day at Copenhagen, we brought 350 young people from all around the world there, and many of them kept coming up to me that last day. These are people who grow up in places where you don't get the sort of luxury of thinking about the world that we do, and they kept saying, look, we didn't expect this to happen right away. We're up against the biggest industry on earth. It's going to take a while. We're going back and going to work. And so that's what they did and what we did. And in fact, last fall, despite Copenhagen and despite the Senate not doing anything and whatever, we had another one of these days, and it was bigger still, 7,400 actions in every country in the world except North Korea. And it was beautiful and powerful, and we are doing it again this month, and we need you to be there. Where's our crew who's organizing in San Francisco? Stand up, guys, so people can see you. They are going to pass around clipboards so that you can sign up to make sure that you're coming on Saturday, September 24th at noon to Hermanson. Where is it? What is it called? Justin Hermanson Plaza, okay? It's going to be a great day. We're calling it Moving Planet, and this time it's going to focus on transportation above all, and the great symbol will be the bicycle, because bicycles are part of the solution, and because bicycles are beautiful, and because bicycles are one of the very few tools that both rich people and poor people in this world use, and we need, among other things, to attach stigma to the automobile and glamour to the bike, okay? So that people around the world do not do the crazy thing we managed to do in this country over the last 60 years and build their entire lives around the automobile. So this is going to be a beautiful day, and it's going to be all over the world, and it's not going to be enough, okay? It's not going to be enough because it's part of building a movement, but only part. And the adversary that we are up against, above all the fossil fuel industry, the richest and most profitable industry the world has ever seen, is not going to give up. In fact, just the opposite. They continue to spend more money and do more lobbying and more thoroughly corrupt our political systems all the time. Last year, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, okay, was the biggest funder of campaigns in America. They gave 94% of their money to climate deniers running for office. All right? They've done everything they can on behalf of the energy companies they represent to make sure that we do not take any action at all. In fact, they filed a brief with the EPA last year saying, we didn't need to take any action on climate change because if the weather warmed, humans would be able to adapt their behavior and physiology in order to deal with the problem, okay? This is craziness. I mean, if someone came up to you on Telegraph Avenue and explained that their plan for dealing with global warming was that they were going to alter your anatomy, you would just consider it part of daily life in Berkeley, and that would be that. But if someone comes up to you apparently says nonsense, but hands you a campaign check for $30,000, you say, what a good idea that is. If we're going to beat these guys, one of the things we're going to have to do is engage them, fight them, be more aggressive and confrontational than we have been in the past. And that's part of what this tar sands thing was about, and I want to end by talking about it for just a minute. The tar sands up in Alberta are a great horror, and they're one that I should have been working on long ago. If you've ever been up and seen them, they're astonishing. An area the size of European countries, just torn to pieces. The biggest dams in the world are constructed to hold back the polluted water that comes out of these things. The biggest machines in the world working this thing, and they've only gotten so far about 3% of the oil that's there. Okay, they've only just begun. They've made life impossible for the native people whose land this is, and whose cancer rates are through the roof, and traditional culture destroyed and all of that, and we should have worked on it long ago, but at any given moment on this planet, there are 1,000 horrible things going on, and so you don't end up working on all of them. And the reason that I got involved, again, stretches back to Jim Henson, that great NASA climatologist. And he published a paper earlier this year calculating what would happen if we did as Canada would like to do, and the oil companies would like to do, and take most of that oil and out of that sand and burn it. And what he said was, he said there's enough carbon in there. It's the second biggest pool of carbon on Earth after the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. He said if you do it, then there's about 150 parts per million more carbon in the atmosphere, okay, if you could burn it all. He said it would be, if we develop these unconventional fuels like the tar sands and shale gases, he said it's essentially game over for the climate, all right? Which is a pretty stark warning. And it's why we went to work on this stuff. That and another reason. We went to work on it because, for once, it was a very clean political fight. Barack Obama can stop this project by himself. He does not have to go to Congress and deal with Jim Inhofe or any of the other dysfunctional people who have stymied him on many times in the past. If he wants to, he can stop it all by himself. All he has to do is not sign the presidential, it's called the Presidential Certificate of National Interest. And so we decided that it was worth trying to see if people were willing, if we try to match the oil companies dollar for dollar, we're obviously going to lose. That's what happens when, Exxon makes more money than any company in the history of money. We're not going to match it, okay? So we decided to see if we could find an alternate currency to work in. And for the last few weeks, that currency, that was our bodies. And we spent them, I think, pretty well. We managed in the course of 2 weeks to take what had been a regional issue and make it a national one, indeed an international one. One of the wonderful things about having this network of people around the world that we know and love now is that they rose to the occasion. And on every continent, people showed up at US and Canadian embassies. They closed down the one in Wellington, New Zealand for a day, to send the message to Canada that it was tarring literally what had been its really quite good reputation around the world. We managed to do that, and we managed to put Barack Obama on notice that this was the big environmental challenge that he faces. In fact, one of the most remarkable things that happened was that the day after we came out from jail, my dear friend Gus Speth and myself wrote a letter to all the major environmental organizations in this country, and they then collaborated on a strong letter to the president. You may notice that environmental groups are not always the greatest thing in the world at collaborating, hence the large number of envelopes that appear in your mailbox on a regular basis. But they wrote a strong letter saying there is not an inch of daylight between us and the people out being arrested on your doorstep. And that came from the corporate-friendly Environmental Defense Fund, and it came from the corporate-unfriendly Rainforest Action Network, and it came from everybody in between, and it was powerful. They said, we expect nothing less than that you will block this thing. So those 2 weeks were well spent because they gave us the groundwork for trying to run this campaign now through this fall. The president has said he will make a decision before the year is out. We're going to have to figure out how to continue that campaign. And I'm going to ask you guys to help. One of the things that's clear to me is that as we do this campaign, the greatest favor we could do the president would be to attack him, all right? To come off as sort of marginalized and angry people. We're not going to do him that favor. We are going to pay him the dangerous compliment of taking seriously his words in 2008 that inspired so many of us, all right? And we're going to ask him to hold himself to the standard that he set, which is a fair thing to ask. If you don't mean things, you should not say them. If you get up and say the night that you're nominated, in my presidency, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow and the planet will begin to heal, then when you have the opportunity to make good on those words, you have to do it. And so people will be going politely, but firmly, to campaign offices around the country in groups and explaining that they worked very hard for the president last time because of those promises, okay? And that they need him to honor them. And the courage that people have been showing in the last couple of weeks is really something. There were a number of young people who had risen to high position in the Obama campaign in 2008, which in certain ways was a kind of children's crusade, you know, and it was remarkable what young people managed to do. It didn't surprise me because that's who I work with every day, but I think it surprised, and it clearly was what fueled the Obama campaign. And the campaign was always better than the candidate, I think, from the very beginning, you know. But even though I liked at that point the candidate, but several of those high Obama youth officials came and got arrested. And they did it despite immense pressure from people still in the White House not to do it, telling them that they were burning all their bridges and cutting their opportunities and they went anyway, okay? Doesn't mean anything what are they going to do to me for getting arrested? Nothing, you know? I mean, I'm past the point where but when you're 22 and with a great opportunity, well, that they were willing to do that is A, great courage, and B, a warning signal, I think, to the Obama administration. It's not that everybody's going to go vote for Rick Perry instead. Almost nobody is. But that is not how you win elections, okay? You don't win them with votes. You win them with support. You win them with people who are inspired and hopeful and out there making sure that all their friends are turning out to vote and that people who never vote do. And that's, I'm afraid, not going to be possible. So, we're going to be in Obama offices and things. And we're also going to be back in Washington. And it looks like we'll be back in Washington on October 7th and 8th, which is when the government has scheduled the final hearings on this Keystone thing. Apparently, they failed to check the calendar and noticed that it coincided with Yom Kippur. But that's, unfortunately, part of the time when we're going to be there. And we may need you to come, or to find other people to come. Not, I think, although we're not sure, not, I think, to be arrested. I don't think, you know, you don't want to do exactly the same thing twice in a row, you know. We need to surprise them, but we've got some other ideas about what might look beautiful and powerful and meaningful if we can get some people there. So I hope 3 things: that you will think about coming if you're asked. I hope you go to tarsansaction.org and sign up so we can ask you easily so that we know where you are. I hope that if you come, you'll come in the spirit that we're trying to do this in, which is not a spirit of anger or of bitterness or anything else, but a spirit of a certain kind of great trepidation, but also of hope. Maybe a little bit of hope against hope. I mean, things like this ruling on the ozone regulations last week were shameful and fill me with fear that we're not going to win this. But still, I think the bottom line, in a sense, is that we have to refuse to be cynics until we absolutely have no choice, okay? The refusal to be a cynic is, in certain ways, the most dangerous stance you can take. And one of the ways that we're going to do it is if you come, we're going to ask you to wear a necktie or dress or something when you come, all right? That's what everybody who got arrested was wearing these last couple weeks. And there was a reason for it. And the reason was this. We want to make it clear who in this fight are the radicals. All right? Now, I know that Berkeley holds dear its reputation as the birthplace of all kinds of radicalism, you know. That's a proud history, but I got to tell you, you guys are pikers compared to the oil companies, all right? Abbie Hoffman got famous for a little while in the 60s when he, you know, threatened to put LSD in the water supply of some town, you know, and everybody freaked out, and it was like, every single day, Exxon and Chevron and BP and whatever make their money by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere in ways that the scientific community has promised us will be ruinous, okay? That is what they do. They alter the composition of the one atmosphere we have. There is nothing more radical that anyone could think of to do. Nothing. And in that sense, all the rest of us who want something like the planet on which we were born to survive need at a certain level to be conservatives in this fight. That's sort of what we're talking about here, all right? That the world we were born into is precious enough to be worth defending. I'll just end by saying, I wish I could tell you that this was all going to work. I don't know. I don't know if we can beat the tar sands, although our odds have improved in the last couple of weeks. I don't know if we can beat global warming. There are scientists who think we waited too long to get started. There are political scientists who think the other side has too much power. If you were a betting person, you might be wise to bet that we were going to lose because we've lost for 2 decades. And yet that is a bet you simply are not allowed to make. The only moral response when the worst thing that ever happened in the world is happening in front of your eyes is to try and figure out what you can do to change those odds. And it's been the great pleasure of my life these last few years to travel around the world with an enormous carbon footprint, organizing and talking to people in every corner of the planet, in rooms like this one, often in rooms with countries where people have done nothing to cause this problem, and yet they are willing to join together in common cause to solve it. That takes more grace than I think I'd have. I think if I was a Bangladeshi, I think I would shake my fist at some Westerner arriving to tell me what we were going to do to fight climate change. I think I'd say, you've done quite enough already, thank you, get the hell out of here. But people are more gracious than that and willing to engage, and that requires of us some kind of graceful answer and response. It's always an honor to be in those rooms. It's a great honor to be in this room filled with so many people who have been fighting this fight for a long time, and I know we'll fight it for a long time to come. I don't know if we will win, but I know we will fight as long as it takes, and it is a great privilege to get to do it side by side. Thank you.
Takes the mic a minute to warm up. We have a few minutes for questions, but could everyone pass the clipboards to the aisle so that the volunteers can pick them up? And the 2 people that'll be running with the mics, which I hope are going to work, are Laura Lynn on this side and Joy on this side. Joy, raise your hand so folks can see you.
Fire away.
Hi, my name is Simon. When are we going to form the 350 political party and take Congress, take our local boards, and take our the actual America to a different state? We need an evolution, not a revolution at this point in time.
You have stronger, you may have a much stronger sense than I really have of how we're going to do this, what form these political changes will need to take. I think at this point, I see our role at 350 in a certain sense as trying everything we can do to get this ball rolling and then watch sort of what forms it starts to take in many places. Our problem is that as a world, we've been stuck in neutral for a very long time with nothing going on. And so when we do things like we just did in Washington, and as we're doing with this tar sands campaign and stuff, it provides some openings. What form exactly those openings are going to lead us to take, I don't know. Starting political parties and things is obviously a vexed project in this country and hasn't come to a great deal when it's been done in the past. And I don't know exactly what form it's all going to take. That's why, for the moment, we look for the ways that we can kind of start things happening. We have to still build this movement, make a movement without knowing exactly where it's going. That makes me, in many ways, an unfit leader for all of this, which is why it's good that there are now sort of ways that we can lead jointly, that we can kind of figure out how to work as a crowd to figure out where we should head once we get moving. But it has been great to watch people all over the world at least rally around one thing, around this number. And it's odd, as I said at the beginning, we were sort of worried that picking this number would not be such a good idea, that it would be kind of depressing because we were already past it, and hence people would just throw up their hands. And that turns out not to be true. My sense of human psychology has changed a little bit since then. One of the things we came to realize that it was sort of like going to the doctor and getting your cholesterol checked, you know? And when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, if you keep eating like that, someday your cholesterol will be too high, nobody's response is to do anything, all right? But when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you're in that zone where people have heart attacks, and if you don't do something soon, you may already have had a little stroke, and that's the day people buy the sneakers and take the pill and do whatever else they're supposed to do. And so that's still the stage that we're at here, I think, in many ways. One of the good things is that as we work around the country, people in every city and town and things in which we work do these things like these days of action, but then quickly figure out how to work together within those communities to make political change in the ways that it's possible in those places. And that's been really exciting to see happen in place after place after place.
Hi, my name is Glenn Wokenfeld. I'm one of the co-leaders of Berkeley High School's Green Academy. And I want to start by inviting you to our academy because our kids need your inspiration. And along those lines, I'm curious about what you would say to 15, 16, 17-year-olds to keep them hopeful and inspired in the face of such an uncertain reality and dark future?
Well, it's a perfect question, and that's who we work with all over the world. That 17-year-old in Ethiopia who was running things in Addis Ababa was not some exception. That's who's many of our best organizers all over the world are. And what I'd say to him is, get the heck out there and organize, You're not, don't wait for something. I guess one of the things I try to tell all my colleagues that I work with is not to think of themselves as youth organizers or something, okay? You got to be just strong political force right from the get-go. And never mind that you're 17, you're perfectly ready to go do this. And the thing that's impossible for people is, global warming seems so big, and all of us so small that our sort of chance of doing anything about it seems remote. And if nothing else, things like 350.org allow you to understand that you have many, many, many colleagues all around the planet who are working in the same direction. And that gives one enough sense of possibility to make it seem at least within the realm of possibility that we'll get out of this thing. And that's what, so I would sit down that 15, 16, 17-year-old and just show them hundreds of these pictures from all over the planet and say, that's you in China, in Mongolia, in Sudan, in wherever it is, and that needs to be you in Berkeley, and we'll see you, September 24th, ready to get started.
I hope you'll forgive that this is just the way that I have formulated this question. I'm not sure how much sense it will make or not make. But it seems to me that the things that you're speaking about are primarily politically oriented. So what we're talking about is a kind of a message orientation or an awareness orientation. And one of the things that crosses my mind as I listen to you and I think about the carbon, and I think about the mention that you make of a corporation like Exxon being the wealthiest corporation in the history of the world, has to do with supply and demand. And the idea that someone might respond by talking about the fact that there has been, forgive the expression, an ocean's worth of demand for the products that the oil companies have been selling.
Absolutely.
And I wonder what aspect of the work that's being done, the amazing, wonderful work that's being done, is thinking about the demand aspect of that and how that sort of, how it factors into what you're talking about.
So that's a really good question. And it's, of course, much of the work that we talk about all the time. So when we get to Moving Planet Day, it's going to be about bicycles, okay? And that's about demand for oil, and it's about the fact that we don't need to live the ways that we do. It's about the fact that if you go to Copenhagen right now, 40% of people commute to work via bicycle, you know? They've figured out how to make that easy and possible. And when we did this thing last year in every country but North Korea, what we were doing was a global work party, and there were people putting up solar panels and retrofitting houses with insulation and doing all those kind of things in all those places. We're building local community gardens, on and on and on, doing that. And then at the end of the day, putting down the hammer and picking up the cell phone and calling whatever they had, President, Prime Minister, Politburo, saying, look, we're getting to work, what about you? You know, trying to combine, because here's the thing. If we had 100 years to deal with the problem that we had, the best way to do it would be the kind of slow, gradual cultural, economic evolution. That's the way human societies and human beings and things should change, untraumatically, easily, over time, and so on and so forth. And I have no doubt we could do it. Our problem is that physics and chemistry doesn't leave us that period of time. It leaves us a much, much shorter window in which to operate, and that means that we can't work mostly additively, one household at a time and then another and another. We're going to have to work largely multiplicatively, and that means politically. That means we have to change the ground rules. That means we have to, at some point, attach a serious price to carbon to reflect the damage that it does in the atmosphere. That's the sine qua non of getting some action to really happen, but we can't attach that serious price until we've broken the power of the fossil fuel industry. In the end, it's fundamentally a political battle, and that's who it's being waged by. Human beings and the future and the rest of life on Earth against the profit imperatives of a very small number of people in a very few concentrated industries. And that's the fight. And it's taken me a while to kind of understand exactly how stark and simple the fight is, okay? But that's the fight. And that's why we have to build this kind of movement.
Hello, and thank you so much for the work that you do. I wanted to ask, given the movement that you created and the extensive network that you have globally, I wonder, along, I think, with many people in the crowd, why you don't back a very simple fee and dividend solution to the carbon problem, putting a steadily rising fee at carbon on the source and returning the dividends to the American people, creating the incentive for people to move and creating a level playing field for...
So the good news is I do back it, and
Right,
I've written a lot about it.
Yes,
And-
exactly.
And so here's just so everybody understands what she's talking about, because
Yes.
it really is like, here's what we, if you were designing the wisest policy we could design at the moment, here's what it would look like.
Thank you.
Instead of the insanely convoluted cap and trade thing that failed miserably in the Senate, you'd put a big honking tax on Exxon, collect it at the wellhead, okay? And the result of that would be that Exxon would dramatically raise the amount of money that they charge you at the gas pump. That's good, okay? We need to pay the same price as Europeans do for gasoline, because then we'll start to live like Europeans. But that's not going to happen. You may have noticed that tax increases at the moment in this country are not an enormously popular method to get yourself elected to office. It will not happen unless we take that money that we just collected from Exxon and just write everybody a check every month for their share of it, for their share of the sky, as it were. As if it belongs to anyone, it belongs to us, not to Exxon, okay? And if we do that, the person who's introduced the first real bill that looks like this in the Congress is Maria Cantwell from Washington. And it's, at least it's partway in this direction. It's
similar, but
it's not,
still
we
has
can
a
argue about all its, intricacies. But
yes.
Maria Cantwell, seconded by the senator from Maine.
Collins.
Olympia Snow, I think. Maybe Susan Collins. I don't. But at any rate, that is something that you can see how politically that might work. And in fact, as her bill is drawn, 80% of Americans come out ahead. They get more money than they pay in tax. If you have a Learjet, then you come out behind, okay? But you deserve to come out behind if you have a Learjet. So it's a very smart plan. And it is, I've written time and again that I think it's the thing that we need to be doing. And there are people working hard, particularly on it in this country. The Citizens Climate Lobby.
I'm a volunteer with the Citizens Climate Lobby.
Are people
Yes, I am.
doing really good work.
Yes.
So thank you for that
Thank
very
you.
much.
Hello. Hello. Hi. My name is Will. I'm a student here. As a peace and conflict studies student, my question is a little different. How would you convince the Pentagon or the Joint Chiefs of Staff to invest in climate change mitigation and international cooperation as a national security priority?
So this is a really good question. And in fact, it's one of the places where we're actually making some real progress. Say what you will about the Pentagon, okay? And there's plenty to be said about them. This is in their favor. They deal realistically with the world, all right? They don't live in a complete fantasy world that they invent on their own. They sit and think about the world as it. Now, their conclusions that they often draw, or that the people who boss them around draw, whatever, are often wrong-headed. But they have, there have been a series now of papers, important findings and papers from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others that have clearly established that climate change is what any rational person would observe it to be, the biggest threat that we face. Forget on this scale about terrorism, all right? Compared to that, climate change is a much, much larger and more insidious phenomenon, and they've started to come to realize that. There was a remarkable series of papers published in the Pentagon last couple of years ago where people sort of gamed out all the various strategies, all the various conflicts that were going to arise in place after place after place as drought and flood and things pushed people, above all else, pushed people away from where they're living now into someplace else. Migration is the single great destabilizing factor in place after, and you can already see it happening. If you go to India, the India-Bangladesh border, they've built a 2,500-mile-long wall between the two countries because India knows that Bangladesh is sinking, There's 140 million people there, and there's not room for 140 million people in India. And, you can multiply that by many, many times. So the Pentagon is actually starting to think about these things. Part of that simply because the Pentagon is always really good at making sure it always has some job to do so that it can continue to soak up an inordinate share of, the country's finances, all right? But on the scale of things, I'd much rather have them worrying about this than worrying about the things they worry about else, I think it would inject a note of political reality. And it's worth noting that there are other forces that we normally think of as conservative who will play a role here. Among other things, evangelical Christians are going to be, I think, a help, not an hindrance in this work, more and more and more. And one of the reasons is that they send millions of Americans every year on mission trips to poor parts of the world, and they come back understanding to some degree what's going on. That's why among young evangelicals we find enormous support for this kind of work, and I think that that will continue and grow. So there are all kinds of possibilities for anyone who's not. The problem with the sort of people who are running for president now and things is that they're basically employees of the fossil fuel industry. That's where their money has come from. The Chamber of Commerce, the Koch brothers, all these kind of people. That's what the problem is, and that's what we got to confront. That's a good question.
Bill, we've run out of time for questions, but here's your closing remark. Give us the call to action.
I'm afraid I'm pretty much talked out. I just really want to say that that the privilege of the last couple of weeks in Washington, and it was a deep privilege, and I think the other people who were there will second me about this, to feel the sense of solidarity and of kind of meaning that just rises up naturally when you decide that you've read enough and heard enough and all of that, that you're ready to really start putting it on the line in what, and I don't just mean getting arrested, because that's just one tactic among many, but that you're ready to commit in some deep way to doing the thing that in the back of your mind you kind of know you have to do and that we should be doing and that we should have done. There's something oddly liberating and relaxing about that. And I got to say, I was, though uncomfortable, more in a sense relaxed when I was in jail than I've been for the last 5 years. And I was talking, next to me was this guy, Gus Speth, okay? Next cell over, the epitome of the establishment environmentalist. He ran Jimmy Carter's Council on Environmental Quality. He ran the UN Development Program. He was a dean at Yale. He's at Vermont Law School now. A wonderful guy who's done all the... He said at one point in that weekend as we were lying there on, not sleeping and stuff, he said, you know what? I've been in a lot of important positions in this town, but none of them seems as necessary as the one I'm in right now. And I really understood what he said. You don't have to go to jail, but damn it, you got to do something that takes you to places you haven't been before. And I look forward to being there with you. Thank you all.